It's hard, at least for me, to gauge whether this is common knowledge or not, but the country of Iran used to relate to the world in an entirely different way than it currently does. I presume some of you might be aware of the British and American-backed coup d'etat in 1953, but for the purposes of this video, and also because I feel like it, I want to begin this video even further back in time. 1814, when Iran, then Persia, had just lost most of what is today Azerbaijan to Imperial Russia. This would be one of many moves by European powers that would reduce Persia into a state teetering on the edge of subjugation. This was all a part of a period of history called the Great Game, where Britain and Russia would compete with each other for the domination of Central Asia from Tibet to Istanbul, and Iran was caught in the crosshairs. This would culminate in the Anglo-Russian Convention in 1907, where the two empires decided how they would split their influence over Iran. Then in 1909, Britain created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which took the exclusive right to control prospecting rights in nearly 3/4 of Iran. And here is where the fierce and independent-minded suspicion of foreign rule began to gestate into what we know it as today. Iran's intelligentsia, its bourgeois, and its Shia clerical establishment began to work vigorously to turn their country into a respected nation, and not one subject to the games of European empires. In 1906, they managed to create a constitution and parliament. However, the meddling of the Russians and English, the conflict between the Shah and the parliament, and the intra-parliament conflict caused Iran to be weak enough for one Brigadier General Reza Khan to take over in 1921. Reza Khan became Reza Shah and established the Pahlavi dynasty. Seeing its neighbor, the Ottoman Empire, be carved up into French and British colonies, and the Soviet Union begin encroaching on its border, Reza Shah sought to ally itself with literally anyone else. The United States was his first choice, but they rebuffed him, considering Iran part of Britain's sphere of influence. This left Germany as the only viable option to curb the influence of the English and Russians. By 1937, relations between Nazi Germany and the Shah were close, and by the 1940s, Germany had become Iran's largest trading partner. In 1941, the Allies wanted to use Iranian territory in order to send the USSR weapons. Reza Shah declared Iran to be neutral in the war and refused. The USSR and the United Kingdom responded by invading. Reza Shah abdicated and exiled himself to South Africa, where he would die soon thereafter, and his son was now the Shah. Mohammad Reza Shah was 22 years old at the time, which is actually around my age, so imagine if I was given charge of a country. I like the idea. He was a weak ruler initially, and his father's autocratic rule was replaced with a more powerful parliament. The movement that had caused the creation of the original constitution and parliament was now back, and it would be determined to finish what the constitutionalists in 1906 had started. The Allies' occupation of Iran was basically a continuation of the struggle of the Great Game, but now there was a third competitor, the United States. The US demanded access to Iran's oil. The British secured its oil interests and backed southern tribes and parties. The Soviet Union turned the Kurdish and Azeri-populated provinces into socialist governments and backed Iran's Communist Party named Tudeh, the masses. When the war ended, everyone was supposed to leave after 6 months, but the Soviets decided to stay a little bit longer, until it was pressured out by the US and the British. The Soviets left their Azeri and Kurdish autonomous regions in 1946, which Iran, with US and British support, subsequently destroyed. It is in this context that Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh would be elected as the Iranian Prime Minister. A veteran of the early constitutional movement and a critic of Reza Shah, who wanted to modernize the country, Mossadegh spent the beginning of World War II in prison. When he was released, he was able to create a coalition of communists, liberals, and the religious in 1949, all united in the desire to finally bring an end to authoritarianism and Western meddling in Iran. In 1951, he became prime minister. Seeing how foreign powers would tear Iran apart, fighting for oil concessions from Iran, Mossadegh decided to nationalize the oil industry in 1951. British oil companies organized an economic blockade against Iran, preventing him from using the oil revenue to modernize the country. At first, the US was supportive of Iran's nationalization, but then in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected president. Eisenhower was convinced by the British that the communists would take over Iran and agreed to go along with a British-planned coup d'etat. The US would call this Operation Ajax, and it would result in the Shah regaining all of his autocratic powers and Mossadegh spending the rest of his life in house arrest. From 1953 to 1979, the Shah would be the uncontested ruler of Iran, and his country would be yet another nation added to the Pax Americana. For a variety of reasons, people hated the Shah. The surrounding Middle East was undergoing an era of anti-colonialism and nationalism, as a variety of Arab states sought to be independent, and many Iranians looked at their CIA-installed government and felt agitated. Iran was used by the United States as the region's policeman, and was referred to as a Little America. The Shah was also a dictator, who established a secret police called the Savak, with the help of the CIA, the FBI, and Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad. This secret police would make people disappear and create a culture of paranoia. Thanks to the United States and Israel, people in Iran could not trust each other. Naturally, this system would face opposition, which was based in the leftists, the intelligentsia, the traditional landowning bourgeois called the Bazaris, and the Shia religious establishment. And we all know who would eventually come to power. The Shia religious establishment, headed by Ayatollah Khamenei, would take the reins of the revolution and establish the Islamic Republic of Iran. With the Shah ousted, Khomeini could develop his vision of Vilayat al-Fiqh, or an Islamic government with popular sovereignty. The way this ideology works is super imperative in explaining the Islamic Republic's ability to survive and relate to the world. Khomeini, through his ideology, sought to maintain a balance between jihadi and ijtihadi impulses. Jihadi here refers to an approach to Islamic governance that is combative and inward-looking in its implementation, while ijtihadi refers to an approach to Islamic governance that is creatively interpreted based on human reason and the changing times and circumstances. This approach to Khomeini's Islamic governance is expressed in almost every aspect of the Islamic Republic's domestic and foreign policy. The government is therefore bifurcated in light of this jihadi-ijtihadi approach. There is an ijtihadi parliament elected by the people, but the candidates must be permitted by the jihadi government of the supreme leader and other organs of power held by the Shia clerical elite. There is a regular army called the Artesh that is charged with protecting Iranian territory, and then there is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, who protects the revolution. We even see this jihadi-ijtihadi split in foreign relations, where Iran will, on jihadi grounds, condemn the United States as a great Satan, but on ijtihadi grounds will work with China despite it oppressing its own Muslims, and being more committed to atheism than the United States. Iran sees the United States and Israel as existential threats to itself. Its entire security policy is designed to address this threat. Iran has adopted what is called the Mosaic Doctrine, a strategy dedicated to asymmetrical warfare, and deterring attacks against Iran and denying enemies from gaining any strategic advantage over Iran. Iran deters attacks by making the prospect of invading it one of the most nightmarish things a war planner could imagine. It watched as the United States struggled in its attempts at urban warfare in Iraq and in the face of guerrilla tactics in Afghanistan, and designed their defensive strategy around these weaknesses. Iran has delegated wartime powers to 31 IRGC-led commands, giving them the ability to act independently, which makes capturing and holding one province as difficult as possible. Almost immediately after the Islamic Republic was declared, it had to face the fact that it was surrounded on all sides by regimes that did not welcome it. The Arab nationalists, the Sunni monarchies, Israel, and the USSR with its invasion of Afghanistan all caused Iran's security policymakers massive headaches. Almost all of these were regimes in some way or another backed by the United States, and thus it would be in Iran's best interest to deny US influence in the region. The possible consequences in the minds of Iran's policymakers are akin to what happened during the Iran-Iraq War. Sunni Arab nationalist Saddam Hussein invaded Shia and theocratic Iran with the backing of the imperialist United States in a grueling 8-year-long war that caused $593 billion in damage and killed 500,000 Iranians. And thus, Iran set about trying to increase its soft and hard power throughout its neighbors, and the first place it was able to get a foothold was Lebanon. When Israel invaded in 1982, and Iran was able to turn what was a spontaneous, mostly local, and disorganized Shia resistance into what is now Hezbollah. Besides just funding Hezbollah's armed resistance, Iran gave Hezbollah the ability to provide social services to the Shiite community, ensuring the spread of Iran's soft power in Lebanon. For example, after the 2006 war in Lebanon, Iran provided Lebanon assistance by rebuilding schools and key infrastructure. The relationship with Syria was something that began to gestate almost immediately after the Islamic Revolution. At first, it manifested in Syria blocking Iraqi oil pipelines in its territory in exchange for discounted oil and allowing Iran to use parts of occupied Lebanon to support Hezbollah. Later, as the Assad regime became more and more isolated, Iran gained more and more influence, and Syria became a sort of junior partner to Iran. Iran was also one of the first nations to send troops in support of the Assad regime during its civil war. Iran's relationship with the Palestinians also proved to be one which it could quickly seize upon in order to expand its influence at the outset of the revolution. It gave what used to be the Israeli embassy to the PLO, and initially they supported the Islamic Revolution. That was until Arafat backed Iraq in its war on Iran, and later Ali Khamenei called Arafat a traitor and an idiot for engaging Israel in negotiations. Hamas was much more receptive to the Islamic Republic, and soon after it was established in 1987, and after the PLO began negotiating with Israel, formal ties were created between Iran and Hamas. Hamas, however, has not been 100% in line with Iran's foreign policy, as it initially supported the Syrian opposition to Assad during the civil war, hoping to see a friendly Muslim Brotherhood government emerge as it had initially in Egypt. For a while, this was the extent to which Iran could extend its influence. That is until... After 9/11, George Bush was able to convince himself and his country that invading Iraq and Afghanistan was a good idea that would make America safer. In reality, these invasions gave Iran opportunities to expand its interests. By getting rid of the Sunni-dominated Arab nationalist government in Iraq, killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and destabilizing the country so that the Islamic State could take hold, Iran was able to exert an extraordinary amount of soft and hard power into Iraq. Iran doesn't have total domination of the country, but it does have proxies in the form of the Popular Mobilization Forces, and even without them, Iraq's politics are now dominated by heavy skepticism of the US, to put it mildly. Iran became Iraq's largest trading partner in 2015, and it was able to provide weapons to Iraqi resistance that accounted for a fifth of US combat deaths. Later in the 21st century, Iran would gain yet another opportunity to expand its influence with the outbreak of the Yemeni civil war. The Shia Houthis are armed and backed by Iran against the Saudi, GCC, and Western-backed Hadi government. The American intervention in Yemen has been such a disastrous and brutal war that it has put some, but not many, significant strains on the US-Saudi relationship, thus weakening the connection between two of Iran's enemies. The war has also seen its proxies practically win the civil war at this point. It was also able to divide the GCC against itself after the internal strife concerning the Saudi-led blockade of Qatar, gaining Iran an ally in Qatar. From what I've written so far, it seems that Iran is on a pretty spectacular rise that could see it become a much more powerful country in the Middle East. But things are not that simple. Firstly, as mentioned, many of Iran's gains are products of US mistakes. The US's policy of being unable to meaningfully accept that Palestinians have rights, of invading and creating power vacuums in Middle Eastern countries, and other such failures could possibly end, and thus it leaves Iran without many opportunities to expand its power. In addition, despite involving itself in the Syrian civil war, it was not able to make a substantial impact towards protecting Assad's regime. Instead, it was Russia who effectively propped up Assad after it intervened in 2015, and Russia's position in the world is now dubious. Iran might not be able to fill the role of Assad's senior partner anymore. Syria is a Sunni majority country, unlike Iraq, and doesn't even have a substantial Shia population like Yemen or Lebanon, and thus it does not have a lot to work with in regards to soft power either. As mentioned earlier, Afghanistan is also an issue that Iran considers heavily. The deposition of the Taliban in 2001 was a great opportunity for Iran since it fostered ties with Afghanistan's Shia minority and the anti-Soviet, anti-Taliban Northern Alliance. In 2002, it pledged $560 million for Afghanistan's reconstruction. In 2006, it added another $150 million in loans and donations. In 2008, it gave out $300 million in loans. In 2015, there was an estimated $2.4 billion of trade between the two countries, and Iran volunteered to pay the office expenses of then-President of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. And then the Taliban took over. The collapse of the JCPOA, colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal, also renewed strains on Iran's position in the world. I'm not going to go too much into the nuclear deal because that is its own can of worms, but in general, the deal saw Iran's economy recover from the decades of sanctions and was also verified on numerous occasions by the International Atomic Energy Association as abiding by the standards of the agreement. In 2018, Donald Trump threw the agreement in the trash. However, in case you haven't heard, he ended up not being President of the United States of America in 2020, in an unremarkable election that probably flew under your radar. And now Joe Biden is in charge, and, he's taking his time. Renewed negotiations began a year ago in Vienna, and they've gotten stuck on the US's position that the IRGC be regarded as a terrorist organization, which Iran wants the US to not do. What I have just discussed are stumbling blocks and challenges to Iran's geopolitical expansion, but ultimately that is not the greatest threat to the Islamic Republic as of now. The inception of Iran's jihadi-ijtihadi divide was something that people in 1979 could be compelled to support. They remembered the Shah, and they witnessed Khomeini's resolute figure lead the revolt in real time. But slowly and surely, as the revolution was preserved, a new generation was born that was not very impressed with this bifurcation of their participation in government. Disenchantment began with the election of Sayyid Mohammad Khatami in both 1997 and 2001. He was a liberal-minded politician and enjoyed support from the youth, but they became increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress he was able to achieve in the jihadi-dominated system. In 2005, his term ended, and he was replaced by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, following a push by conservative elements in the regime. He was not like other former presidents, in that he came from a rural, non-clerical family and was elected by appealing to conservatives and the Iranian poor. He sponsored a lot of redistributionist and populist policies that interfered with the financial elite's plans so much that his finance minister resigned in protest. He took a confrontational position towards the West, which brought along many rounds of sanctions. For reasons such as this, Iran's economy stagnated. In 2009, there were new elections. The reformist and pragmatic clusters using exit polls thought that their coalition had won. However, after the vote was counted, but before the vote was customarily supposed to be announced, Khamenei congratulated Ahmadinejad. This caused the other candidates to call the elections fraudulent, and it spawned the biggest protest movement in Iran since the Iranian Revolution. It was dubbed the Green Movement, and the government sought to crush it quickly. In the crackdown, dozens of people were killed and hundreds were arrested. The opposition's candidates were put under house arrest. This moment in Iran demonstrates the limits of the jihadi-ijtihadi structure of the government in the face of actually representing desires that are steadily becoming more and more secular. With the struggling economy, the Islamic Republic now has to deal with the possibility that its accommodations of popular sovereignty might not be enough to stem people's genuine political desires. Ever since the Green Movement, protests continue to occur one after the other on a continuous basis. Despite Iran's movements to gain more power in the Middle East, it might all be in vain if the Islamic Republic destroys itself with its stubborn refusal to listen to its people. Is Iran going to be the next Middle Eastern superpower? It seems this is only possible so long as other contenders for the title continue to make mistakes, right? But what is certain is that Iran has now embedded itself so deeply in the politics of its neighbors that any chance of what policy experts call regional stability, but what us regular folk call a chance for people to live good and happy lives, is going to rely on lowering tensions with Iran. As mentioned, this, as it was titled, was a brief review of the subject in question, and I would be very open to the prospect of going deeper into Iran's involvement. This is the end of the video. I can keep this in. Involvement in the region. I decided I wanted to keep this video short in light of the massive project that I'm going to embark on, where I plan to create a history of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. I still have not received my books yet as of writing this, and thus I made this video in the meantime, because I'm not one around to just sit around and do nothing. If you would like to support this channel, please subscribe, like, comment, share this video to a loved one. If you would like to do even more, support this channel on Patreon. Patrons get their name read out at the end of the video. What an amazing thing to happen to people. I will now read out the amazing patrons who are great. Rita, Sailor Susie, Pyrotic Napalm, Avocado Kirby, Tom Rollins, Martial Law, Ravignon. Thank you all so much. You are the best. And now the video is over. Thank you all.